It's good to see everybody tonight. We are in the book of Isaiah. We've been doing this kind of survey-based study for a little while. We're going to look at chapters 36 through 39 tonight. And if you, I gave you that. Let me I'll grab my Post-it note real quick. But just remember that I mentioned to you last Wednesday that so 36 to 39 is tonight. Which is a whole lesson in that outline, if you've got that whole big outline. So then the next lesson is chapters 40 through 48. We'll do that next week. Then the next lesson is 49 to 53. I'm going to spend 2 weeks on that. And then the final lesson in that outline book is 54 through 66. I'll spend 2 weeks on that. And we'll finish out then the book of Isaiah, Lord willing, at the end of December. So that was the plan. And again, if you ask me afterwards if you didn't catch that or if you didn't get those written down. So let me ask this question tonight as we begin. Do you like history? Because if you fell asleep in history class in high school, just try to do something. Hold your head like this or something, because just humor me a little bit. Because that's what we're dealing with. Chapters 36 through 39. Mike, never mind. Mike was back there actually doing it. He's already worried about it. But it's all history. Chapters 36 through 39 is what we might refer to as a historical interlude within the prophecy. So we've been doing what for the last several chapters? One word. Well, but one word that describes all those chapters. Judgment, right? Judgment, 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 judgment. It was just all over those chapters from various nations and peoples. So Isaiah takes a breath and he begins this historical kind of interlude. And it's interesting, right? Because if I told you, where would you go to learn something about the kings of Israel or Judah, what chapters or what books in the Bible would you tell me? Okay, I'd go to 1st and 2nd Kings. Where else might I go? I might go to the Chronicles, or I might even go, if I want to get those early kings, the book of Samuel, right? I'd go into 1st and 2nd Samuel to gain some insight as it relates to that. But it's interesting that for at least these 4 chapters, Isaiah becomes a historian. He's not just a prophet sending out judgments against nations or prophesying about coming events and those kinds of things. Isaiah becomes a historian for a little while, and he talks about a period of time about which of those kings in Judah. Who's Hezekiah, right? Hezekiah is the subject of conversation, and what Assyrian king? Sennacherib. So you've got this interlude of history in these chapters where Sennacherib is on the doorstep of Jerusalem, right? He's been overtaken just about any place that he goes. He's the Assyrian king, the great Assyrian king, and he's on the doorstep of Jerusalem, and he's basically sent some ambassadors in there to have a conversation with Hezekiah and his princes and say, listen, we're coming. You can either embrace it or fight us, but I'm telling you your better option is to embrace us. And so let's just start down the path a little bit and talk about this historical moment. So in verse 1 of chapter 36, you'll notice that it just simply says, now it came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the defense cities of Judah and what? And took this. So he's had success in the region. Okay? He's had success in Judah itself, but hasn't taken what? Jerusalem. So he's been pretty good at dealing with some of the outskirt cities, even some walled, fenced cities, but he hasn't been able to get in Jerusalem yet. He hasn't had that kind of success. And so he's trying to figure that out. How is he going to accomplish being able to get into Jerusalem? Add just real quick, just to show you this interesting kind of correlation between the Chronicles of the Kings and Isaiah. In 2 Chronicles chapter 32, I'm going to start in verse 1. I'll show it to you on the screen. But after these things and the establishment thereof, Sennacherib, who Isaiah is dealing with there in those chapters, king of Assyria, came and entered into Judah and encamped against the fenced cities and thought to win them for himself. When Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib was come and that he was purposed to fight against Jerusalem, he took counsel with his princes and his mighty men to stop the waters of the fountains which were without the city, and they did help him. So there was gathered much people together who stopped all the fountains and the brook that ran through the midst of the land, saying, Why should the kings of Assyria come and find much water. By the way, real quick, what reasoning would you give to try to stop this flow of water? Okay, so starve out the army, right? So why would we give them provisions? If they're going to come up against us, then let's wall off the water. Let's create some pools in Jerusalem, which they did, and let's just kind of supply ourselves for a period of time and not supply the king of Assyria and his impending army. Also, he strengthened himself, verse 5 of chapter 32 of 2 Chronicles, and built up all the wall that was broken, and raised it up to the towers, and another wall without, and repaired Milo in the city of David, and made darts and shields in abundance. So, when he sees Sennacherib coming, 2 Chronicles helps us appreciate that he basically starts getting ready for it. So he stops off any supply of water that might aid the enemy. He pools that in Jerusalem so that it can help his people. He begins to get an armory built up, some weaponry ready, because here comes this Assyrian onslaught, and the success rate that Assyria had had up until this point is pretty strong. But here's the interesting part I found anyway. Verse 32 of 2 Chronicles chapter 32. Generally, you would hear this phrase, now the rest of the acts of Hezekiah, are they not written in the Chronicles of the Kings? Or are they not written by the, right? You hear that kind of language often when you're reading through that history. He says, now the rest of the acts of Hezekiah and his goodness, behold, they are written in the vision of Isaiah the prophet. He actually references, the Chronicles of the Kings actually references the prophet Isaiah. You want to know the rest of the history of Hezekiah? Go read the prophet Isaiah. That's what he says. Go read what the prophet had to say about Hezekiah if you want to know more about the story that unfolded in the midst of that. So let's look at this history now. So Sennacherib, and I'm going to try to tell you to it in story form so we can move through it, but Sennacherib tells Hezekiah that I'm coming in battle. I'm coming. And are you really going to trust Egypt? Remember, we've talked about all these allegiances and alliances that various nations had built. And so Sennacherib of Assyria basically sends messengers into Jerusalem, says, go tell Hezekiah and his people that I'm coming, and he may not want to trust Egypt to get him out of this. He may want to rethink that. In fact, that fellow's name is Rabshakeh, if I'm saying that right. And you can pronounce it any way you want, and we'll both probably be wrong. But anyway, and Rabshakeh said unto them, verse 4, now I'm back in Isaiah. Say ye now to Hezekiah, thus saith the great king. Don't you love a guy that's confident? Go tell him this. Thus saith the great king Sennacherib, right? He's speaking on his own volition. And somebody else isn't saying this on his behalf. He's saying it of himself. You go tell them and say unto them, Hezekiah, thus saith the great king, the king of Assyria, what confidence is this wherein thou trustest? I say, sayest thou, but they are but vain words. I have counsel and strength for war. Now whom dost thou trust that rebellest against me? So Sennacherib sends this ambassador, Rabshakeh, and he begins to share with the princes of Hezekiah, listen, you need to let your king know, here's the message of our great king. Lo, thou trustest in the staff of this broken reed on Egypt, whereon, knows how much he thinks of Egypt, whereon if a man lean, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh king of Egypt to all that trust in him. You want to lean on Egypt, good luck, right? Because it's like leaning on a staff that what? That's going to break. And when it breaks and you're leaning on it, it's going to pierce you. Sennacherib says to Hezekiah through these messengers, listen, I don't think I'd trust Egypt if I were you. That's like leaning on a staff that's sure to break, and you're probably going to have yourself pierced in your hand if you try that. And then he comes up with this interesting kind of misconception of what Hezekiah was really all about. Notice verse 7. But if thou say to me, don't trust in Egypt, Sennacherib says, but if you'll say to me, we trust in the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah hath taken away, and said to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar? Here's what I want us to appreciate about that. Remember how we've talked about in the past throughout this study that there are times where God uses men for His purposes and they don't fully grasp and understand what God's really doing. Sennacherib looks at Hezekiah and he hears about how Hezekiah had torn down what? Yeah, he'd torn down the high places, right? Notice 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 4. He removed the high places. This is Hezekiah's work. He removed the high places and broke the images and cut down the groves and brake in pieces the brazen serpent that Moses had made. For unto those days the children of Israel did burn incense to it, and he called it Nehushtan. It's interesting, right? You remember those fiery serpents that came amongst the people during the days of Moses? And if they were bitten, they would die. Moses looked for a remedy, and God told him, listen, you need to make a brazen serpent and put it upon a staff, put it upon a pole. And when somebody is bitten and they look at it, they'll live. Well, guess what they did with it? They kept it and turned it into an idol. It had become something that they were actually worshiping to, and they'd held on to it. And Hezekiah finally comes along, finally a good king, wise enough to realize the fallacy of that. And he says, go tear down the high places, go tear down all those idolatrous altars, get rid of Nehushtan. We don't need that around anymore. He's trying to cleanse the people of idolatry, but what did Sennacherib think he was doing?
Tearing down places to God.
That's right. He thought, well, how would their gods have any interest in helping Hezekiah? He's been tearing down all the altars. He's been tearing down all the places you worship their gods. Why would God help you? Sennacherib's got a false misconception, but he tries to use it, unwisely so, but he tries to use it against Hezekiah and say, I'm not so sure you'd want to trust a God that basically you've been insulting by tearing down all the places that people can worship Him. Why would you do that if you really had interest in trusting Him? And so Sennacherib's doing anything that he can to try to get Hezekiah to build an alliance or an allegiance with Assyria. Notice verse 8. Now therefore give pledges, I pray thee, to my master, the king of Assyria, and I will give thee 2,000 horses, if thou be able on thy part to set riders upon them. So Assyria king says, don't trust Egypt. That's like leaning on a staff that's going to break and just stab your hand. Don't trust your God, because you've done insulted Him by tearing down all the places to worship Him. What you want to do is trust me. And if you'll trust and pledge to me, I'll give you 2,000 horses if you can find enough guys that know how to ride them. You notice that kind of if you guys really are you got enough people around there in Judah that might be able to ride these horses, maybe I'll help you out and give you these horses for your riding men. That's the kind of man Sennacherib is. In fact, he's so confident that his messengers were told to tell Hezekiah that not only is your God not with you, He's with who? He's with me. Sennacherib says, He's not with you. You've torn down all the places to worship Him. He's actually with me. Now that wasn't uncommon, by the way. Many kings in those days would try to call upon the gods and try to threaten any enemy that they might have and say, listen, the gods are with me. The gods are supportive of my work and my wars and my battles. You might not want to trust them because they're all aligning with me in relationship to that. I couldn't help when I thought about those kings kind of declaring that. It's kind of like two coaches praying for a victory of the same football game, right? Who's he going to listen to? Who's on his side in the midst of that? But that's the mindset. Sennacherib's trying to play this game with Hezekiah. Even though it was not uncommon, he actually, through his messenger, says, and am I now come up without the Lord against this land to destroy it? The Lord said unto me, go up against this land and destroy it. The Lord told me to come. Hezekiah, you might want to be careful trusting in Jehovah because He told me to come. Now, if you read a little bit about that, did Sennacherib have Jehovah in mind? It's hard to tell, right? Because he has this already demonstrated his misconception of the God of that land, because he thought that the gods had been insulted by tearing down all the high places and the altars and so forth. So his understanding of who Jehovah was and his understanding of the God was right. It was some misconception. So some think that maybe just his messenger Rashibi, I'll say that 35 different ways before the night's over, but just kind of used a word they would know. So he says Yahweh, because that's when they would hear that, they would think God, they would think Lord. And so he uses a phrase. And I think verse 11 kind of helps us appreciate that. Because here's Hezekiah's princes and leaders. Eliakim and Shebna and Joah said unto Rabshakeh, Speak, I pray thee, unto thy servants in the Syrian language. For we understand it, and speak not to us in the Jews' language, in the ears of the people that are on the wall. Hey, we can speak your language. So let's not talk in the Jewish tongue here. Why wouldn't they want Sennacherib's messenger speaking in the Jewish language? Yeah, I don't want the people responding to that, right? They're concerned that if the people start hearing these threats and understand the message that Sennacherib is sending, they may be weakened by that. And you get the people afraid, it's going to be hard to lead them in the right direction. So they say, don't speak to us in that language, in the Jewish language. We understand Syrian. Just speak to us in that. And then, I'm not going to read it, and I'm not going to put it on the screen. Verse 12 is colorful. I'll just leave it at that. You can read that for yourself. But verse 12 is very colorful in how he responds as to who he wants to be able to hear this message. But basically, he says, I want everybody to be able to understand what I'm saying. In fact, he stood in verse 13 and cried with a loud voice in the Jews' language and said, Hear ye the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus saith the king, Let not Hezekiah deceive you, for he shall not be able to deliver you. Pause for a minute. That's important. When this message comes, he says to the people, you hear him shouting, everybody along the walls could hear, you don't want to trust your king. Hezekiah is not trustworthy. Don't let him deceive you. Just keep that in mind. We're going to see something different later when a different message comes, but I just wanted you to note it because we'll come back to it. Notice verse 22. Then came Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, that was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and Joah the son of Asaph, the recorder, to Hezekiah with their clothes rent, and told him the words of Rabshakeh. So all of these things that the ambassador of Sennacherib comes to tell the people, he's relayed that to the princes and messengers of Hezekiah. They're now heading back, and if you show up in sackcloth and rent clothes, what's going to be the reaction of the king? Yeah, this ain't going to be good, right? This isn't going to be good. I've got messengers showing up at the door of the palace. They aren't renting their clothes as they're telling me. They've already rent their clothes and in sackcloth before they even get there. And this is not going to be good things that they have to share. I'll push the brake. That's chapter 36. Anything you caught that I missed?
Was this not part of the judgment against Israel? I mean, maybe God was using them to punish him?
Well, and we're not, no, we're not quite there because it's going to change. It's going to change here in a minute. But he was definitely used for Israel, northern tribes, right? Judah's going to be different. Judah's going to be a little different.
He's trying to get the leaders under his control.
Sure. Which, by the way, go ahead, Jim, I'm sorry.
You can do it, but then you'll have more control over everybody else.
Yeah. It's much easier to control the people if you can control the leadership, right? And that wouldn't have been an uncommon thing for those kings to attempt to do. Okay, keep moving. Chapter 37. So it came to pass when King Hezekiah heard it, that he rent his clothes. Now he's frustrated by what he hears, and covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. And he said, Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and the elders of the priests, covered with sackcloth, unto whom? Isaiah. We got to talk to Isaiah about this. Hezekiah is a good king in a lot of different ways. He wasn't perfect. He's going to falter, right? He falters late. But he's a good king. And one of the things and evidences of his wisdom is when this message comes, he doesn't run to soothsayers and like many of the other kings had. He doesn't run to the guys that just kind of would bolster him up. He goes to the guy he knows he's going to get it straight through. So he sends them to Isaiah. Go talk to Isaiah about this. I need to hear from the real prophet of God. And I think that's a great signal for Hezekiah here, that he's wise enough to know where he should go. So they get sent to to Isaiah because they want to know what the real message of God is. Sennacherib says God told him that I'm supposed to come and destroy you. What's God really saying? Verse 5 of chapter 37. So the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah. And Isaiah said unto them, Thus shall ye say unto your master, Thus saith the Lord, Be not afraid of the words that thou hast heard, wherewith the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. They don't speak on my behalf. Isaiah tells Hezekiah's scribes and leaders, you go back and tell Hezekiah that Sennacherib's messengers aren't speaking on behalf of Jehovah. They're speaking on behalf of Sennacherib. In fact, they've blasphemed God, he says. And behold, I will send a blast upon him, and he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. God says he thinks I'm sending him to destroy you. No, in fact, I'm going to send a blast towards him. And it's interesting, right? God can do anything. And it's always amazing when you read through the history of Scriptures that sometimes he just goes, right? He just sends people into battle and he deals with it that way. All it took was for him to send a rumor, breathe a rumor to Sennacherib that gets him thinking, I need to go home. When he gets home, fast forward for a minute, we'll see it before we're done. But when he gets home, then what happens? A coup, right? A coup happens and he ends up dying, right? God didn't have to send anybody with the sword himself to take care of it. He just sends a rumor to Sennacherib. Sennacherib goes home and then he ends up destroyed because of it. But God says, listen, don't listen to him. I have different things in mind. And so before it was he says, let not Hezekiah, before, I'll get out of it, I couldn't read my own notes for a second. Before, remember what I pointed out to you, it was don't let Hezekiah deceive you. Jehovah has sent me. Now notice verse 10 of chapter 37. Thus shall you speak, this is Sennacherib's message back. Thus shall you speak to Hezekiah king of Judah, saying, Let not thy God in whom thou trustest deceive you, saying, Jerusalem shall not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Wait a minute, I thought God sent him. One minute Sennacherib through his messengers is saying, God has sent me. Jehovah has sent me to destroy you. Well, they send message back and said, listen, we've consulted Isaiah the prophet and he says otherwise. Well, then you might not want to trust that God then if he's telling you otherwise. Now that's Sennacherib's. First, don't trust Hezekiah. Now it's don't trust that Jehovah, your God, because I'm going to take you. Do you not know what we can do to you? Basically is what he says. Verse 11. Behold, thou hast heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, by destroying them utterly. Shalt thou be delivered? You guys think you're better than everybody else that we've come against? You somehow think that you can escape? That's the pride and arrogance of Sennacherib. I destroy everybody I come and fight, he says. Nobody resists what I do. Nobody can stop me. And you can trust your God. You can try to trust Egypt, a broken staff. You can trust whatever you want to trust. But I'm telling you, if I take a notion to defeat somebody, that's what I do. If you look at the history, you'll know that. And so what I appreciate about Hezekiah now the second time. First time, wants to know the truth, so he sends for Isaiah. Now he hears the response of Sennacherib, and so he does what? He prays. Prays. Hezekiah received a letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. And Hezekiah went up unto the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. Here's what they've said to me, Lord. And Hezekiah prayed unto the Lord, saying, O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, that dwellest between the cherubims, thou art the God, even thou alone. Of all the kingdoms of the earth, thou hast made heaven and earth. Incline thine ear, O Lord, and hear. Open thine eyes, O Lord, and see, and hear all the words of Sennacherib, which hath sent to reproach the living God. Of a truth, Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste all the nations and their countries. Can't deny that, he says. They've cast their gods into the fire, for they were no gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they have destroyed them. Now therefore, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that thou art the Lord, even thou only. Love Hezekiah on so many levels. Goes to the prophet when he wants to know the truth. Prays to God when he needs help. And now he says to them, he says, listen, deal with him so that everyone will know that thou art the Lord, thou only. You're the only one worthy of that. And so if you fast forward in chapter 37 to the end of it, by the way that he came, by the same shall he return, and shall not come into the city, saith the Lord, for I will defend this city to save it for my own sake, and for my servant David's sake. And then the angel of the Lord went forth and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. 185, right? 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses.
That's just a thought I had.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, I'll go back and make sure, but 104 score, 4 score being 80, 185,000 fall. And so Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and went back to Nineveh. And it came to pass as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god, that Adremelech and Sherezer, his sons, smote him with the sword. The great king that nobody dared to threaten or challenge, nobody could defeat, the one that felt so proud that he could even lie and deceive about who it was that was sending him to deliver Judah into his hands, has now died by the sword of his own sons. And they escaped into the land of Armenia, and Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his stead. God didn't intend for the Assyrians to take Judah. Now we're going to learn here in a few minutes who was supposed to come. Babylon's coming. Judgment isn't over for Judah. It's coming. And they're going to buy some time because of the goodness of Hezekiah. But ultimately the Babylonians are coming, but not the Assyrians. They had some success in the region of Judah, but they're stopped before they were allowed to come into Jerusalem. And thousands of them are destroyed. And Sennacherib goes running home, and his own sons put him to death and advocate the throne. That's the piece of history of Assyrian history that Isaiah wanted to add to this conversation. And that kind of, in some ways, encapsulates that first half of the book of Isaiah in a lot of fashions, as you move to the Babylonian conversation next. Thoughts or anything about these two chapters?
They killed 185,000. How many left?
Innumerable, right? You have no idea to know how many for sure. Any other thoughts, questions about those two chapters? Chapter 38. So Hezekiah gets sick, and he's sick, right? He's nigh unto death. He's sick unto death, and Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz, came unto him and said unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Set thine house in order, for thou shalt die and not live. So then Hezekiah turned his face toward the wall and prayed unto the Lord. Again, what you love about Hezekiah is that he recognizes real source of benefit and strength and help. And once again, when he feels threatened and his life is challenged, he goes before the Father and said, Remember now, O Lord, I beseech thee, how I have walked before thee in truth, with a perfect heart, and have done that which is good in thy sight. And Hezekiah wept sore. Now, Isaiah's basically come and said, you might want to make sure everything you need to get in order is in order, because it looks like you're going to die. And so God spoke back to Isaiah then another time and said to him, Go and say to Hezekiah, verse 5 of 38, Thus saith the Lord, the God of David thy father, I have heard thy prayer, I have seen thy tears. Behold, I will add unto thy days 15 years. Now, I've always viewed that good and bad, by the way. Right? Why is it good? I got 15 years. What's bad? I got 15 years, right? I've been blessed, right? I was nigh unto death. I wept, I prayed, I beseeched. And God sends Isaiah back to me and says, all right, listen, I'm going to give you more years, but he restricts it. He confines it and says, I'm going to give you 15, not innumerable, 15 more years. So you can look at that both ways, right? Good for the moment. Yeah, year 14 and a half, right? You're thinking pretty heavy about that. But notice verse 16. O Lord, by these things men live, and in all these things is the life of my spirit. So wilt thou recover me and make me to live. Behold, for peace I had great bitterness, but thou hast in love to my soul delivered it from the pit of corruption. For thou hast cast all my sins behind thy back. For the grave cannot praise thee, death cannot celebrate thee. They that go down into the pit cannot hope for thy truth. It's interesting messaging, isn't it? Hezekiah is basically saying, listen, I've tried to be good. I've tried to honor your will, tried to follow your truth, and I can't continue to do that if I'm gone. If I'm dead, I can't do that. Can't do that from the grave. I can't do that from the pit, he says. I can't praise you. I can't celebrate you. I can't be one who's promoting your truth. The living, he shall praise thee. As I do this day, the father to the children shall make known thy truth. The Lord was ready to save me. Therefore we will sing my songs to the stringed instruments all the days of our life in the house of the Lord. May only be 15, but he's going to do what? He's going to sing the praises of God the rest of those days. It seems to be the implication of that. For Isaiah had said, Let them take a lump of figs and lay it for a plaster upon the boil, and he shall recover. Reminded me a lot. Remember, there was a blind man that came to Jesus, and Jesus did. Remember, he spits on the ground and he makes some clay, for lack of a better word, and he anoints the man's eyes with that and tells him to go wash where? Am I right? Yeah, right. Go wash in the pool of Siloam. And he went and washed and came seeing. Reminded me a lot of that scene. Here God says, I'm going to heal Hezekiah. And he could have just what? Done it. He could have just done it. But Isaiah, through this process, makes this ointment, for lack of a better word, and anoints this boil that must have been the issue that he had. And he was able to recover. And Hezekiah also had said, What is the sign that I shall go up to the house of the Lord? So, you successfully deal with Sennacherib and Assyria. Then you get sick, right? Nigh unto death. You get an initial word that looks like this is it. And you want to make sure that everything you need to have in order is in order. Then he prays and weeps. God sends Isaiah back, says, okay, I'm going to bless you with another 15 years. And so he's restored back to health. But there's one final piece of the history we need to look at tonight before we finish. And that is, ultimately Hezekiah the 15 years will be up. And the Babylonians are eventually going to be the ones that come in. And it's interesting why it is that God explains to him his frustrations. So Babylon has taken over Assyria, and they're now really the major nation in the region. And at that time, that guy, it's on the screen, the son of Baladan, I imagine this guy, they probably just called him Miro, because you'd never want to go through all that rest of that name. But anyway, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, this early in their history, sent letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he had heard that he had been sick and was recovered. Now, it's funny, right? I've always been amazed by that, just to take 30 seconds here. I've always been amazed by the fact that they lived in a technologically disadvantaged world, and yet they still knew, right? The king of Babylon had heard by different people going from place to place to place to place to place, telling the story, had gotten word, or maybe in some kind of formal ambassadorship could have informed him. But it's amazing that word had spread to Babylon that Hezekiah had been sick and recovered from his sickness. And the king of Babylon sent flowers to the king. Well, okay, we don't know what it was, but right, that's what he does. He sends flowers to King Hezekiah. Glad you're better, right? That's kind of what's happening here. And so Hezekiah has these guys show up from Babylon, and he's so glad to see them. Verse 2 says that he showed them the house of his precious things, the silver and the gold and the spices and the precious ointment, and all the house of his armor, and all that was found in the treasures. There was nothing in his house nor in his dominion that Hezekiah showed them not. Oops. Right? You just showed them that there's reason for what? For them to come. There's reason for them to come and take it. He just showed them all the value was there, right? You know, it's like if you don't want your car broken into, install an 8-track player, right? Look, none of you got that. That's funny. You should laugh at that, right? You don't want, right? Who would want that? So you skip on by. You don't show everybody everything you've got, but he does, right? He shows everyone. And so Isaiah comes to him and says, "What have you done? What have you done?" Then came Isaiah the prophet unto King Hezekiah and said unto him, "What said these men? And from whence came they unto thee?" And Hezekiah said, "They are come from a far country unto me, even from Babylon." And then said he, "Well, what have they seen in your house?" And Hezekiah answered, "All that is in my house have they seen. There's nothing among my treasures that I have not showed them." And then said Isaiah to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days come, that all that is in thine house, and that which thy fathers have laid up in store unto this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, saith the Lord. And thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, shall they take away. They shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." And then said Hezekiah to Isaiah, "Good is the word of the Lord, which thou hast spoken." And he said, "Moreover, there shall be peace and truth in my days." I struggle with that, right? I struggle with that a little bit because it's interesting anyway. Hezekiah, because I don't know him, right? I don't know him. I know historically I understand the record of Hezekiah, but I don't know him. You know, sometimes you hear somebody say something like that, and if you know them in a personal way, you can kind of get where they're coming from. But it seems as if he basically says, well, at least I'm going to have the 15 years, right? At least I'm going to have the days. And maybe it's just pure respect for Jehovah. Whatever God says is good. Whatever He says is good. Even if it means I'm losing all the prosperity that we've been gathering up, even if my sons are carried away, if that's God's plans and purposes, it is good. It's interesting language, right? That Hezekiah uses there in response to what doesn't sound good. You're losing it all. Babylon's coming, and they're taking it all. In fact, we know that ultimately when Babylon falls, what are they doing with it all? Belshazzar's throwing a great big old drunken feast, and they're using all these things that they took from the treasuries as the utensils for the great big party that he was throwing. And then the handwriting comes on the wall, and that whole scene unfolds as well. But it's interesting that God warned him here of all these dangers and difficulties that he was creating for himself because he chose to show them all the treasures that had been built up. Last second thoughts, questions, things you might have thought of that I didn't bring up in our study.
What are you talking about with the sundown and the shadow going back 10 degrees? Well, I don't understand.
Yeah, no, and I looked at that a little bit, and I didn't have the 35 minutes tonight to address it. But I'll look at it someday. Maybe I'll jot some notes down and look at. It was an interesting little interlude within the interlude, and I began to walk that road, and then I knew there was no way to be able to get what I needed done tonight and try to go down that path too.
When this guy from Babylon saw all that stuff, they said, well, we can beat this.
Yeah,
There's no problem.
Yeah. It's all interesting how God's various uses of all these nations kind of unfolds. Lord willing, next week then we'll pick up in that pattern that I showed you. We'll start and be in chapters 40 through 48. If you thought 4 was fast tonight, wait till we do 8 next week.